The Nerdcast Empire is on the air. It is another episode of Music Mondays here on the Nerdcast Empire. I am Matt, back in the studio. We are going to take a look at the music that was released on or around March the 15th. Another really good week of music, and helping me do that, as always, joining me in studio is Mike. Mike, how's it going?
I am doing all right. Looking forward to another good week of music.
Yeah, another really solid week of releases. Joining us from Parts Unknown on this Easter Sunday is Chris. Chris, how's it going?
A little tired from playing with the kids, but I'm here, and also, like Mike, happy for some music.
Now, I'm not a big April Fool's guy. Obviously, we're recording this on Easter Sunday, but as it plays for our listeners, it'll be April Fool's Day. I guess in hindsight, we could have picked 6 really hilarious releases from the day and told people those were our actual picks, but maybe it's for the best. We're still pretty early in this podcast. We don't really want to maybe troll our listeners, the ones that are very dedicated to listen to Music Monday every Monday.
I just hope that people don't think that is what we did based on our picks.
That's true. These are very serious picks.
God, those are terrible. Yeah, they are. That was the intent.
No, these are our real picks for Music Mondays. Of course, Mike, each and every week, will put together a list and we go through it, and then we pick 2 new releases that we really like, and then we will go into the vault, which can be literally anything, old release or potentially a greatest hits album or a soundtrack, anything that we find that we want to bring to the attention of the group. We will bring that in segment number 2. We're going to take a look at releases for March the 15th, and I'll be honest, and this is something that maybe isn't clear to the people who listen. Typically, I make my picks last because I'm just busy. I had 16 hours worth of baseball and softball this weekend, so the guys usually get to go through and make their picks, and then I usually pick choices from what's left, because I mean there's still a lot of great choices and even some bands we didn't choose. But I'll be honest, of all the weeks we've done this, Mike probably picked 2 bands that I certainly would have considered very strongly, especially his what I assume will be his second pick. But 2 really excellent choices this week from Mike. So Mike, we'll let you get to it. As always, what is your first pick for the week of March the 15th?
You know, I can't help it that I do have the greatest taste in music. I've tried not to, but I can't do anything about that. Yeah, you know, I could have gone several different ways with my picks this week. I kind of bounced back and forth on maybe 4 bands total and settled on these 2. My first pick, though, is going to be the second album from a Polish, I'd call them classic metal band. Their second album, Serpent's Kiss. The band is Ironbound. Yeah,
these guys had a really good sound, and certainly very much a throwback sound, which I think once you hear it or if you read any reviews of this album is going to be very clear to you.
Yeah, I was kind of taken aback a little bit by some of the reviews I read, just because they compared it so heavily to like Blaze Bayley era Iron Maiden, which, to be totally honest, I haven't listened to much of. Anything in the post Bruce Dickinson before he returned, that kind of 2-album era, I think, wasn't really ever on my radar. But without knowing that, I really didn't have anything to compare it to. But it just, to me, really strong, just kind of old school metal vibe. The website Velvet Thunder kind of suggests that it's meat and potatoes heavy metal, guaranteed to please for a few listens, but likely not stay on your player too long. So time will kind of tell on that, how I feel about it. The other thing that they mentioned too, that I thought really kind of got my attention from the beginning, was just the imagery on their 2 albums. They kind of have a mascot and a certain art style, which really drew me in. May not be the most varied as far as sound from song to song. They're all kind of samey at times, but still really cool. Check out Doomsday to Come, Holy Sinner, Serpent's Kiss, Destroy Our Worlds. If you like metal that could have come out in 1988, you'll probably enjoy this.
I find it interesting, and obviously we've done a few episodes of this now, and we're starting to really kind of get a good catalog of music that we've listened to. But it's interesting to me when we read these reviews, and we do try to kind of get opinions while we still form our own opinions as well. This criticism of, you know, saying something is meat and potatoes almost in a negative connotation, like, well, it's good classic rock, but you're going to get bored with it. You know, I don't think every album has to reinvent the wheel. It's cool when somebody does something you're like, wow, that's really amazing. I've never heard that before. Sometimes it's a matter of producing something that just sounds really good, that, you know, a lot of work went into. And I really feel like when you look at this album, that very much fits that bill. I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that they just wanted to do an album that very much sounds like that classic era of Iron Maiden, the Blaze Bayley era, and they really knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, it kills me because I think sometimes we we use throwback as both a positive and a negative. Part of what we do with this podcast, I think, is we kind of highlight music that comes out that maybe isn't really in fashion or popular anymore, but harkens back to an era that we probably enjoyed more than the current era of music. So it's like, if that's your mission statement, if that's what you're aiming to do, and you do it as well as this band, I can't really fault you for that.
No, not at all. I think this is a really solid release from Ironbound. I think everybody who's a fan of music from that era is certainly going to want to check out Serpent's Kiss. Chris, your thoughts on Ironbound?
I'm right there with Mike as far as the visuals. I was definitely brought in by the album cover. Kind of gave me a cyberpunkish type vibe. But yeah, I'm right with you. Looking at some of these reviews, maybe it's because I can get into a lot of things that most people can, or I'm not as, fine grained into some of this. But when reading a review off of Metal Forces magazine, it says, if you're going to build your sound on tried and tested formulas, then you'll need something extra in there to stand out. And Ironbound just don't have it. And I don't know about that. I mean, like you said, it feels like the comfort food of metal. I mean, yeah, they're going back to that classical metal, but do I necessarily need them to add in a bunch of spice and maybe things that they're not as experienced with just to try to stand out? If this is the sound they're going for, I think they've nailed it, and it's right up my alley.
Yeah, again, and I understand that art is subjective. We will probably say that a lot on this podcast. So every reviewer, we're not trying to invalidate somebody else's opinion, because even amongst the three of us, sometimes one of us is going to choose an album and the other two are going to be like, it's not really my thing, but I can appreciate the musicianship. In fact, I'm sure we've said that on this podcast already. So again, not to take shots at anybody's review or their opinions, but I think for what this band is trying to do, they're not trying to sell you on being something they're not. This is what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to do it really well. And I feel like they did that. So to me, like, it's music I like. They did a great job of it. To me, it's a home run. Ironbound, Serpent's Kiss. Definitely check that out. Again, I think it's a really solid release. You've got two picks as always. So what is your second pick for this week?
So yeah, the second pick, which I would assume is the one that you probably had your eye on as well, is the third album from a Finnish band who's been around since 2003 when they toured under a different name, playing cover songs. But this is Winterborn with their newest album, Break Another Day.
Yeah, I mean, a Finnish metal band, like, come on. Like, clearly that's going to be something that's right up my alley. And I think, honestly, and again, just my opinion, I think this is the best album of any of the ones that we're recommending this week.
Yeah, hearing the first song off of it, it was on my radar pretty much immediately then. And as I went through the tracks, even though they're considered a power metal band, I think their sound has a lot more going on than that. It feels bluesy sometimes like classic metal. And sometimes their singer, Teemu Koskela, sounds like David Coverdale to me. Like, it's just, there's so much going on with this album. Interesting, obviously, being their third album, having been around since the early 2000s, but it sounds like they did have some health issues and family issues and whatnot, and even had to turn down some contract offers recently that would require touring. And thankfully, in this day and age, the idea of self-producing your own album seems a lot more feasible than it did probably in 2003, 2004. Not just as fast as you can go power metal. This has a lot more variety to it, some slower songs, and just something for everyone, I would say. Standout tracks on this for me were Another Sleepless Night, On the Greatest Day, Winterborn, For the First Time Ever, and Through Different Eyes. Good stuff top to bottom.
I mean, there's a reason why these guys' earlier releases were compared to Sonata Arctica, like some of the great power metal releases from Scandinavia, maybe of all time. These guys are really, really good. It's a shame that it's taken so long for them to get something else out, because honestly, these guys should be big stars. They've got a great sound. I would imagine you will be able to see them at some of the open air festivals in Europe this summer. I would definitely recommend that. I haven't listened to the whole album yet, but everything I've listened to, I've liked, which is not necessarily always the case with the albums we recommend on this, but it's been really, really good. It's great to see a band, and we've had this a couple times on the podcast, that kind of go away for a little while, or they just, for whatever reason, life has kind of taken them away from being able to release music, and they come back all these years later and just release something that's awesome. I think this is really fantastic. I definitely want to see these guys live. If they ever listen to this podcast, please tour the States at some point, or maybe we have to make a trip to Europe at some point to catch these guys, because I think they're really talented. Yeah, again, I think this is a really solid release, and I think this is a group that I really want to see play live, because I imagine they really would put on a show. Chris, your thoughts on Winterborn?
Yeah, how would you feel if they opened up for Sonata Arctica in a U.S. tour? I know you mentioned last week Sonata Arctica needs to make another tour around here, and they seem to be right up that same alley, at least as far as visuals, kind of that barren, wintry landscape. I feel like they'd be a perfect fit.
Yeah, I would love that. And honestly, if they could find 3 or 4 more bands like that and just do some big show, I think that would be really fantastic. And anytime we pick a band that's going to sound like this, they're guaranteed one of us is going to have it on their list, whether it's you or me, and you beat me to it this time. But this is really, really good from Winterborn. Break Another Day. Definitely encourage everyone to check it out. We are moving on to Chris's picks. Chris, you have 2 albums this week as well that were released on or around March the 15th. What was your first pick of the week?
I do. My first pick is going to be a band from Cambridge, UK. It is Grieving, with their album Everything Goes Right All at Once. I picked this one. I like to pick bands, as you know, that kind of have a story either behind the production or something they try to embed in the album itself. And the first thing that jumped out at me was I tried to look up these bands' social media pages, and their Facebook page. The very first thing I saw was kind of a post about the album saying that it was going to be released soon, but that soon they were referencing was 2019. And then I had to do a double check, make sure Mike hadn't accidentally put a band on here that released an album years ago. And sure enough, they'd been working on this for the better part of 8 years. And they kind of speak to that on their release day. They posted on Facebook. So like that, our album is finally out. We recorded a number of these songs a long time ago now, but there was always a sense we wanted to get this record right as we could do before we released it. Life got in the way, the small matter of a pandemic, having children, work responsibilities growing as we got older. For all of us, it was the first full album we've been involved in, and today with its release, maybe everything went right all at once after all. It's a relief to know it's finally out there. And just kind of that perseverance of, life trying to get in the way as often as it can, and yet this group of guys, this group of friends just keep pushing forward, and finally that put this album out that they've been working on, like I said, for the better part of 8 years. As far as their sound goes, they label themselves as a mix between emo, punk, and post-hardcore. And I think you get a little bit of mix between all those genres across the whole album. I think it's more of an unpredictable kind of indie alternative sounding album in that way. You start off really fast paced with their opening track, Brian Emo. It slows down a little bit into 10 times Michelangelo. Honestly, for me, it really kind of hit its stride toward the end of track 5, Tarpaulin. The bridge at the end there really I love that. And then it followed right into one of their singles, Wiseau, kind of a tribute to Tommy Wiseau. And it kept strong throughout the rest of the album. But yeah, this was one of those, not necessarily in our metal mix by any means, but definitely one that I wanted to include from kind of the indie scene and just put it out there from a group of great guys that seem to be living their dream.
Listening to this, the first vibe I got, and I think Mike and I were trying to find the right term for it, because sometimes it gets encapsulated as just an indie sound, but it feels almost post-punk. Whatever would have followed that punk movement of the late 90s, early 2000s, kind of encapsulated this sound. And it was interesting. I found a review from Maximum Volume Music that basically compared the band to groups like Fugazi, Husker Du, Buffalo Tom, and Swerve Driver. And I think that's a very accurate grouping to put this band into. But I know you got a chance to listen to the whole album. I only got the chance to listen to the beginning of it, but I know you had some different thoughts as you kind of went through the album.
Yeah, generally, if I see something listed as post-hardcore or indie specifically, I tend to maybe stay away from it a little bit, because I'm generally not an indie fan. But this stuff does kind of remind me of something that maybe a band that was popular during that emo phase, that emo era, would transition to, kind of more that indie sound. So I kind of get where they're coming from. But kind of to Chris's point, the weirdest thing to me was I wasn't really feeling it early on. And like track 4, My Friend the Ghost, I thought was kind of catchy. And then later on, toward the last half of the album, I started enjoying the songs more and more. Tracks like Start Young, Ownership, Old Wives. I thought those were actually pretty cool. Ownership and Puritans both have like a really cool, like crunchy guitar sound at the beginning that I could really get into. And I don't know. I felt like the album picked up steam as it went. And I know that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's interesting because I did feel like the beginning tracks they weren't bad by any stretch, just a little different. But I think, it's interesting to hear. They kind of both of you echo the fact that I think the second half of the album really kind of gets that sound. So if you're looking to listen to this release, maybe that's a good place to start, is at the middle of the album and then double back around to the beginning. But certainly an interesting and it's great to see Grieving be able to get that album out after all these years. So certainly a great choice for Chris's first pick of the week. Chris, you've got 2 picks, though. What is pick number 2 for you?
Pick number 2, I'm going back to the prog scene and staying international, making another trip to Sweden. Got to show Swedish love. This is from a band called Almo with the debut album Reconciliation. Initially, I have to admit, I listened to this. I listened to the first couple tracks and I was kind of blown away by it and went to go kind of look up some more information, like I said, social media, only to find out that this is a solo effort. The artist name is Benjamin Almo Thorsel, of course, going by the moniker just Almo here, but formerly of a band called Frozen Realm. They've since split, so now he's kind of doing his own thing solo, and it just really blew me away. It always blows me away whenever there's kind of a solo effort, and it makes me feel as though there's an entire orchestra behind it. Reading some reviews, it's recommended for fans of Hawken, Devin Townsend, Periphery, Between the Buried and Me, and some of the reviews, once again, I felt were kind of harsh. They kind of make it seem as though it's not just kind of a tribute to bands like Between the Buried and Me, Devin Townsend, and so on, but almost a carbon copy of some of these bands, or just a meshing with very little kind of individual items thrown in. And while I can't say that I've listened to a whole lot of any of those bands or am a huge fan of any of those bands by any means, I'd say if Almo's work has done anything, it's made me want to go and check those bands out more through his work. So I guess be forewarned if you go in there listening to this and you are heavily aware of those bands, that might turn you off, but it definitely didn't for me. Like I said, I was really blown away. Some of the standout tracks on this for me, tracks 3 and 4 were Hope and Bliss. I definitely recommend giving those a chance. Bliss, especially with kind of some of the staccato guitar work, just really slight punchy guitar, almost made it feel like it could have easily been sort of an anime opening. And then if you listen to those and you like them, or if you're just kind of a prog metal fan already and you can handle these songs that are, lengthier, I would go right to the final track, the title track, Reconciliation. It's a 20-minute long song, but to me, it is incredibly worth it. This is an album that it's prog metal, but it flirts with techno at times. I feel like it moonlights almost as alternative. It's got a lot of different genres mixed in here besides just prog metal. I feel like prog kind of tries to lump a lot of that in, but I do feel like it's so much more. But yeah, definitely give this one a listen, and props to Almo for all the hard work to get this solo effort out.
Yeah, I thought it was really solid what I've got to listen to so far. And I read some of the same reviews that you did, kind of talking about something being an homage versus kind of taking parts of songs and putting them into your work. I think there's probably a more lengthy discussion, probably even above our pay grade, as far as what qualifies as a tribute to somebody compared to what is kind of lifting certain songs. But clearly those bands that you listed were influences. You certainly hear them in this album. And again, if you're a fan of prog metal, I think these solo projects are certainly continuing to grow in popularity. This dude's clearly really talented. Like, you can't be untalented and put on this kind of a performance across all instruments, singing as well, and do what he did if you don't have the talent that he has. And so I hope that some of that criticism that we've read online doesn't take away from the fact that this sounds really good, and it's incredibly difficult to do what this guy has done basically by himself. So kudos to him. And certainly hopefully he'll continue to kind of expand as he moves forward into future releases, and maybe we'll get away from some of that criticism and be able to really define what his sound is. And then I think he's home free after that, because again, he's got the talent to be able to do great things in music, I think, going forward. Mike, your thoughts on Almo?
Yeah, anytime a band or artist can do kind of the mixed vocal style and they do it well, I'm impressed. And when you find out it's just one individual, even more so. It's kind of funny. I didn't really see like the details as to what led to his band splitting up, just that over time, like a couple of the members left, and then here we are now. But you just wonder if through all of that, he's just sitting there like thinking, I could do all this myself. Why am I even bothering with this at this point? And obviously where we are nowadays with recording accessibility, we're seeing more and more of these individual projects where it's like, I can play all these well enough. I can get this done. I then wonder too, is these allegations or suggestions that maybe this isn't totally original and even borderline plagiarism, does that come from the reasoning of this guy's playing instruments that maybe he doesn't play regularly for this album and just kind of defaulting to sounds that he's familiar with? And maybe to your point, as he continues, he'll start to develop what really his own signature sound is.
Yeah, I think you're always going to fall back as a musician, especially one that's trying to find that first album with riffs and snippets of songs that are familiar, because most people, when they learn how to play instruments, that's what you're playing. You're not playing, look, this is my original song I just wrote. Like, here's Tornado of Souls. Like, it's like, it's, you're trying to play the things, and, those could just pop back in there. I don't think at least I don't believe there to be any kind of malicious intent or intent to plagiarize anything. I think it's more an homage, and maybe some people see it differently, and that's completely fine. But clearly this dude's got talent. So I'm really excited to see what he does next, and be curious to see, like, is this something that can take off and really be a big project for him? But definitely check this out, Reconciliation from Almo. I think it's going to be a really good listen. Definitely pick that up. I have two choices this week as well. And again, I mentioned there were a lot of great options to choose from. So even though maybe Mike picked a couple that I would normally pick, there was certainly no shortage of things to pick beyond that. So I started out with the melodic glam rock band from Sweden called Lipz. It's Lipz, with their album Changing the Melody. It's another Frontiers band. Big shock. That is almost always my default first listen anytime these lists come out, to see what they've got. But these guys formed in 2011 with the Klintberg brothers, Alexander and Coffee. They decided to build up a new band with their friend Connie Svard. And then they were kind of looking for a front man, couldn't find one. Alexander decided he was going to be the front man, and it worked out really well. They eventually picked up bassist Chris Young. That kind of put all the pieces together. This feels like an album from the glam rock golden days. If you were a fan of that era of rock and roll in the mid 80s, you're really going to like this band. I think they're very authentic to that. The standout tracks to me were Changing the Melody, Bang Bang, I'm Alive, and Monsters, with a Z at the end. I guess maybe fitting for their name, but feels very authentic to that glam rock sound. But at the same time, as some of the reviews I saw, it doesn't feel quite as sleazy as maybe the glam rock bands of the mid 80s. It feels a little more accessible, and I think that melodic nature kind of comes into that. But overall, I thought it was a really solid release. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, they definitely have the image of that sleaze rock period. I kind of compare them to Motley Crue circa Shout at the Devil, just with their makeup and outfits. But yeah, I can definitely see where people might think they're a little too on the mainstream melodic rock, more like something you'd hear on Frontiers than maybe leaning into the sleaze rock vibe. Yeah, I really liked Changing the Melody, Bang Bang. The riff on I'm Alive was really cool. And I Would Die For You, really good ballad. They kind of remind me of, there's a Norwegian band called Wigwam. I could see those two touring together, because they're definitely leaning into that 80s style while being also really melodic.
Yeah, clearly an influence there. And I think it's great to see that type of music continuing to be popular, even if it's outside of the US. Chris, your thoughts on Lipz?
Yeah, I think it's a great mashup of that melodic depth that you kind of want to find nowadays. I don't know if the sleaziness really holds up in today's day and age. So kind of leading on that, but keeping that sleazy image just to kind of harken back to the days, give you some remembrance of those bands like Motley Crue. I think it's a great pairing.
Yeah, I think it's a really solid release. Got a great sound. Definitely check them out as my first pick of the week. Second pick, we went with another one of these super groups. And again, it's another one that I think certainly fits that bill. And if you're a fan of prog metal, this is definitely the release for you this week. It is Whom Gods Destroy with Insanium. It was formed by former keyboardist of Dream Theater, Derek Sherinian. Also guitarist Bumblefoot. I think everybody knows Bumblefoot from Sons of Apollo, and of course some time with Guns N' Roses as well. And Dino Jalusic, who has sung for Whitesnake and TSO, providing the vocals here. It's just really, really good. It's very prog. So I think if you're not a fan of prog metal, if you're not a fan of a group like Dream Theater, you may have a hard time getting into this. I love Dream Theater. I think they're awesome. And to me, this is very much influenced, obviously, understandably why, with their former keyboardist kind of, forming this group. You can see where that influence comes from. My favorite tracks on this album were In the Name of War, the opener, The Decision, Crawl, and Find My Way Back. It's got a great prog sound. It is, again, an incredible amount of musicianship talent goes into making an album like this. And again, I think a lot of the criticism I read online were probably from people that aren't really necessarily going to be a fan of this type of music. And I don't think this is for every metal fan, but if you are a fan of that progressive style of metal, where sometimes you're throwing everything in the kitchen sink onto an album, I think this is a group you're really going to get into. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this as well. It's interesting because, you have Derek Sherinian, obviously Extreme Theater. His keyboards from time to time kind of change what they're doing with the sound. It's like you have something like Crawl that, to me, the beginning of that felt very Dream Theater-ish. But then you had Find My Way Back, which almost sounded like Deep Purple organ music in the song. It really kind of gave it that variety. With Bumblefoot and just the overall bass and guitar sounds kind of having a little lower end, giving it more of a modern prog vibe compared to maybe Dream Theater, which is a little more straight up. Dino Jalusic, obviously, dude can sing. On top of what you mentioned, he's worked with George Lynch, Michael Romeo, Magnus Carlsen. He's kind of been that younger singer du jour for a lot of these established artists. So not surprising they would tap him for this. I think Angry Metal Guy kind of put it best, even though he wasn't totally in love with this album. He said that with such well-known influences and decades of experience, Whom Gods Destroy is incapable of making a bad song. So while later he might malign the fact that all the songs might be a bit too long and all have over a minute long solos, there's no question that these guys are going to produce good music.
Yeah, I think that's a guarantee. And I think they really knocked it out of the park with this release. A release that, when I first saw it, I thought, it's another Frontiers release. But actually, Inside Out Music is their label. So maybe even another label out there that's producing this type of music. It's certainly good to see. Chris, your thoughts on Whom Gods Destroy?
Yeah, I believe this is the second time that we've been referencing Sons of Apollo in just a few weeks, last time being from Art of Anarchy. So it seems like it's not a bad thing to go to any kind of member of Sons of the Apollo or a project they may be working on. Reading off of metalinjection.com, an interview they did with Derek Sherinian, he talked about the inspirations they had for the band and stated it was everything from Led Zeppelin to Meshuggah to Muse and to the most technical of prog. So while they list that there's nothing much that's adventurous here, I go back to, once again, this is comfort food as much as, the previous band was comfort food for classic metal. This is comfort food for prog metal. It's you don't have to do something absolutely crazy. If it's not broke, don't fix it.
Absolutely. I think they definitely live by that and have produced a really great album in Insanium. Definitely check that out this week. Actually came out as of March 15th. So as all these new releases have done, and that is going to wrap up our new music section of the Nerdcast Empire's Music Mondays. We're going to step aside. When we come back, each of us are going to take you to the vault. We will look at a classic release that you should definitely check out. We'll do that on the other side of this time out here on the Nerdcast Empire. Back on the Nerdcast Empire, Music Mondays is well underway. Don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. We have a store at the Nerdcast Empire, so check that out at nerdcastempire.com/store. Coming up this week, we've got a lot of content for you as it is WrestleMania week. Officially, we are very excited for the biggest show on the WWE calendar coming up Saturday and Sunday. We will be doing after WrestleMania podcasts on both nights. So we will record those immediately following night 1 and night 2 of WrestleMania, and those will be uploaded the moment that I get them edited. So you will see those probably in the early morning hours on Sunday and in the early morning hours on Monday. Check those out. And then later on that Monday, 1 week from today, we will have our next episode of Music Monday, when we take a look at the releases from March the 22nd. More great music coming up next week, and we will pick out our favorites and, of course, take you to the vault next week on the Nerdcast Empire. It is time to go into said vault as we take a look at some classic releases that you want to check out. And we're going to start with Chris in the vault once again. Chris, what do you have this week for us in the vault?
Yeah, you guys, you've got your kind of gimmicks that you're doing with the vault, going through the different years and the alphabet for Mike. So I figured, I kind of wanted to come up with something of my own. And each week when we're kind of looking back at albums that we're really into, I always go to soundtracks that I think are kind of overlooked. While I feel like it can be kind of cheating sometimes, having this big mash of bands together and songs from their catalog all being thrown in almost a greatest hits catalog, I feel like there are a decent number of soundtracks out there with all original music for the movie that it's taking place in. So this week I'm going to start that gimmick off. I may not do it every week, but we're going to start with the soundtrack for the 1997 Spawn movie, based on Todd McFarlane's comics. I feel like this is going to get overlooked mainly because the movie itself was kind of widely panned as a not so great adaptation, to put it lightly, of the source material. But it's kind of hard to argue against a soundtrack that's loaded with names like Filter, Marilyn Manson, Korn, multiple songs from Metallica, the Butthole Surfers, and even down toward the bottom of the listing, you've got Henry Rollins, you've got Tom Morello. So from front to back, it's just nothing but big names. And I feel like a lot of the budget for the movie itself went into this soundtrack. I will admit, I think the first half of the album is a bit stronger than the latter half, but that's not necessarily downplaying the latter half. It's just opening up with Can't You Trip Like I Do with Filter and the Crystal Method pairing up, Long Hard Road Out of Hell with Marilyn Manson and Twiggy Ramirez, Satan with Kirk Hammett, and Kick the PA from Korn and the Dust Brothers, which once I came across this movie and this album, Kick the PA became one of my favorite Korn songs kind of all time. And it's a shame that I don't believe it ever made it to a Korn official release, and it doesn't really get played live that often. But yeah, not a whole lot to say. The bands kind of speak for themselves. The album did wind up going gold and charting in multiple regions. Australia, it's gold. New Zealand and the United States, it charted gold. And in Canada, it even made it to platinum. So for a movie soundtrack, it's definitely one that I think people can listen into, and you don't necessarily have to have the movie behind it.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting concept to be able to take rock acts, very popular rock and metal acts, and pair them with hip hop artists and try to come up with some sort of mashup. It's interesting, in the Wikipedia article talking about the movie Judgment Night, this was a tactic they used for that as well, where they combine like Helmet and House of Pain and Living Colour and Run DMC and Slayer and Ice-T. So that was kind of the same sort of thing. So there were a couple of movies at the time that did that, but I feel like that's not something that is commonly done anymore. And it certainly creates an interesting sound. I think that's clearly what they were going for here, something that was definitely unique for a movie like Spawn. And even though maybe the movie part of it didn't necessarily work out like they were hoping for, they certainly created an interesting soundtrack with artists that maybe you wouldn't necessarily equate to working together and working well together. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, kind of looking at the roster that was involved in this album, it feels like there were a couple goals in mind. One, to kind of bring in the people who might have been into like maybe older metal with your Metallica and Slayer influence, try to get them into some of the more at the time current popular acts, as far as like, Manson and Filter, Tom Morello being on there as well, Stabbing Westward. And then also with that DJ influence too, to try to bridge the gap between, because I mean, I'm all for Marilyn Manson at that point in time, but I was never going to go and like look, seek out the sneaker pimps. That was never going to be what I would do. And I kind of feel like this album wanted me to do that. But on top of that, first of all, I haven't listened to Trip Like I Do in forever, so that was kind of cool to hear that again. What happened to soundtracks? I feel like, you have mid-late 90s to early 2000s, you just had some ridiculously good movie soundtracks. And maybe that still happens and I just don't pay attention, but I don't think so. You look up and down here, you got Marilyn Manson being on there, pretty much the height of his popularity between Antichrist Superstar and Mechanical Animals. This, as far as I know, is Metallica's first appearance on a soundtrack, which, definitely went better than their appearance on Mission Impossible 2, which led to all sorts of issues down the road. But yeah, you can list off easily a handful of really good soundtracks from this point in time, and this is certainly one of them.
Yeah, maybe that's a future topic on Music Mondays, is trying to find out what happened to music soundtracks, because obviously this time was a golden era for them. But as far as like pop rock goes, the 80s were a gold mine of soundtracks where you had these collaborative artists that were getting together and creating these ballads and pop rock songs that would just be mega hits that were never on individual albums. They just were created for these movies and were some of the biggest charting songs of the 1980s and early 1990s. So it used to be a very big medium. I don't know that it necessarily is anymore. So that's something maybe we'll have to investigate. But great choice for your pick in the vault, the 1997 Spawn movie soundtrack. Going to head to Mike's pick. Mike, you will move on through the alphabet again this week. I believe we are up to the letter F, and you have an excellent pick for this week's vault pick.
Yeah, made it all the way to the letter F. How about that? This one, it took me a while to get to it because I was trying to think of what random power metal band do I like that starts with F that I could use. And as I was racking my brain to try to figure that out, it then dawned on me, wait, I'm a big fan of Marty Friedman. I have several of his albums. Why not go that direction? So with that in mind, I am picking, I believe it's the first album of his I really ever got into back in the old days, probably late 90s, early 2000s. And that's his fourth album from 1996, True Obsessions.
I love Marty Friedman. I love his music. I think he is one of those people that when you start throwing around the word virtuoso and musical genius, it's probably used far too much. But for this guy, I think he 100% fits that bill and continues to do so even today. But this is a great album.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think around that same time, I kind of was made aware of Cacophony, what he did with Becker. But to me, what blew my mind about this is I really knew him more as the guitarist from Megadeth. So to start listening to this album and just the combination of tracks that were ultra accessible and felt like just mainstream rock tracks, along with some of the instrumentals, which were just downright absurd. I didn't know what I was getting myself into just listening to an album from a guitarist from my favorite band, but this certainly didn't disappoint at all. And
it's interesting because on his website, he goes through this entire album and basically discusses what was going through his mind when he created each of these songs, which I can't imagine there are too many other artists that go back and actually review their own album that way.
Yeah, when I found that on his website, it just made me think, I want to read this about every album of his. I want his take and his breakdown of all of them. Interesting thing about this, too, is that the original album that I got a hold of was the Japanese release, which had extra tracks that were actually some of my favorite tracks on there. The order of the tracks were also different compared to the US release, too, which I thought was bizarre. Kind of my first intro to this album was the song Rock Box, which to me, I thought was a pretty cool opener. Just kind of give you an idea what this guy does on guitar. He doesn't remember it too fondly at this point, but honestly, it reminds me a lot of something like Satriani's Summer Song, and I think that's really cool. But then you move on to Espionage and just the riffing and the weird bass riff there. It's so much diversity from a dude who you thought of as a metal guitarist.
It does make you wonder, knowing now that he wasn't crazy about Rockbox, if that's why it was moved to number 4 on the US release instead of the opening track, that maybe he had some say, because obviously there's about the Japanese release was in April of 1996 and the US release was in October of 1996. So there was quite a bit of time between the two. So I just wonder if he didn't make that call. Like, you know what? That song is not really for me. Let's move it deeper in the album and we'll put Rio as the first track instead.
Yeah, that could certainly be. And I also wonder because a couple of the other tracks that didn't make it their way to the States were Shine on Me and Hands of Time, which I wonder too now looking back on it, if they just thought that wasn't something that they figured Megadeth fans would want to hear from him. So that might have led to their omission as well. But honestly, they left on Last September, and that's about as ballady as you could possibly imagine, and also one of my favorite songs of his.
Yeah, it's another great release. Again, a true genius, a guy I'm really happy we got to see in concert somewhat recently. I hope he comes back around in the States again, because really no matter what he's doing musically, it's just always really enjoyable to listen to. And there's any number of albums of his you could have picked, but this is certainly a great choice this week. Chris, your thoughts on Marty Friedman?
Yeah, I'll definitely have to check out Shine on Me and Hands of Time. I really only had time to listen to the US release, so be interested to check those out. I think it's funny that he didn't particularly like Rockbox. That was one of the ones that stood out to me, and I remember thinking it almost sounded like it could have been an alternative Dragon Ball Z opening.
Yeah,
which maybe he felt it more lean toward the Rock the Dragon than maybe that's why I was so into it as well. But yeah, between kind of my first time really digging into Marty Friedman, getting to check this album out, so you've done it once again. I think my personal favorite track on there was Espionage, and it's funny to read him say that he's always wanted to use that word as a song title. So
that sounds very much like something Marty Friedman would say. And again, just a true musical genius in every sense of the word. And certainly if you ever have the chance to see him live, you must take advantage of that. That would be a missed opportunity if you don't do that. So I'm continuing on through the years of time. We started a couple weeks ago with the 1969 Chicago release. We are now up to 1971. A couple of great choices in 1971. I really considered going with Aqualung from Jethro Tull. That's obviously a great album. Certainly could definitely pick that. I've decided instead, since we talked so much about prog on this podcast, that we were going to go with Fragile, the release from Yes in 1971. Actually, the second album release in 1971 by the band Yes, but probably most notable because it is the first album with Rick Wakeman, who came on to be their keyboardist. He came in because Tony Kaye was not crazy about playing electric keyboards, so he departed the group after they toured for the Yes album, which was their first release in 1971. So they didn't have a lot of time to put this album together after Rick Wakeman joined the group. So there's like 3 or 4 like true songs that were like complete songs that are on this album. And then each of the members of the group basically put together a solo song that is varying in length. And there's a couple of those I thought I really enjoyed, especially on the second side, The Fish, which really sounded like something that could have been cut out of Roundabout. It really felt like it would have belonged in there. And Mood for a Day, which is a really cool acoustic guitar solo song I really enjoyed. But the song everybody knows from this album is the opening track, which is Roundabout. In 2008, the remastered version, they've got about an 8-minute plus version of Roundabout. If there's a prog rock Mount Rushmore of songs, Roundabout is probably on that, I would think. It, of course, gained popularity again in the public eye when it was used as an ending for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's maybe just about the perfect prog song. And if you need to play a song to describe to somebody what prog rock is, that's a pretty good choice. Other good songs on this album, though, South Side of the Sky was good. Heart of the Sunrise, which is very much a true ride on the prog roller coaster, just like Roundabout is. It goes 11 minutes and 33 seconds. Looking at some of the reviews on it, Bruce Eder from AllMusic said, Fragile was Yes's breakthrough album, propelling them in a matter of weeks from a cult act to an international phenomenon, and not coincidentally also marked the point where all of the elements of the music and more that would define their success for more than a decade fell into place fully formed. In 2014, readers of Rhythm magazine voted it the 6th greatest drumming album in the history of progressive rock. So if you're a fan of Yes, I'm sure you've probably already checked this out, at least to some degree, but this is kind of where it all started for Yes as far as what would propel them into superstardom with the album Fragile from 1971. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like when we get to demo a lot of prog music that comes through every week, there's so often that, well, this is really good. Well, this is really good. This is really good. But this part I'm not sure about. And sometimes it's the vocals. Yes, this is an instance where every part of it is just perfect. You take a song like Roundabout, and like Chris Squire's bass line on that is probably, if not top 1, top 3 bass lines in a song of all time. Rick Wakeman's organ sounds are just ridiculous. And I think you can almost kind of overlook the fact that John Anderson has a great voice and it blends itself well with the music. And that's not always the case. So, I mean, what else can you say? It's just flawless.
It is truly, like I said, maybe one of the greatest prog songs of all time. Certainly one of the greatest rock songs of all time as well on the album Fragile. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's got Roundabout. As a JoJo fan, I don't need much more. But yeah, come for Roundabout, stay for South Side of the Sky and Long Distance Runaround. Honestly, as far as 1971 goes for Yes, I'm probably still more partial to the Yes album. Something about Yours Is No Disgrace just hits me just right. And I've seen All Good People, but to put out two albums like that nearly back to back, and with this one being 5 tracks longer and almost 20 minutes longer, it's a testament to how hard they work to produce what might be the textbook prog rock sound. I mean, there's a reason that they are named as an inspiration to such huge bands as Rush. And I don't think you can go wrong with really any of their albums, especially this one.
And you mentioned, I mean, that the Yes album, also released in 71, was certainly a big step in moving forward as well. You mentioned Yours Is No Disgrace, which was the opening track. I've seen All Good People basically as a 2-part song. The first part is really the part I enjoy most. It's called Your Move. It was actually covered by Shaw Blades on their cover album they did a few years ago. But I think that's actually the heart of that song is Your Move. And then All Good People comes back around at the end of the song to kind of round it out. Again, true prog song that's got basically 2 songs smashed together into one song. But those guys are incredible. And to me, we talk prog so much on this podcast that it would be wrong not to pick something from Yes at the first real opportunity. And that is what I have done with Fragile.
Do you think there was a rush to get some sort of album out with Wakeman once he joined the band? It's like, hey, let's get this guy some royalties coming in or something. It just, not that there's anything wrong with this album. It just kind of seems like that cadence is pretty rushed.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't know if it's that or if it's one of those cases where they signed a record deal with Atlantic and Atlantic said you have to release so many albums in a certain amount of time. And they just, for the point where when they agreed to it, it's like, yeah, no problem. And then they're like, oh, wait, that means we have to do 2 albums this year. Like, I'm not sure exactly how that all went down, but clearly worked out because they released 2 albums in 71 that were going to be very instrumental. And then, of course, they would come back with Close to the Edge, in 1972. And then Yes Songs in 1973 and just continuing on from there. But again, truly one of the greats. And again, amazing that anytime we see bands in this era, when it was so much harder to record an album, like nowadays, you could record like 3 albums in a week if you wanted to. The technology was so different in 1971 and that took a lot longer to record and to master and do all those things, especially for a band like Yes that had all the moving parts that it had. Incredibly impressive. I mean, we mentioned earlier in the first segment, a one-man band. To do that in 1971 would have been darn near impossible. Now, with all these electronic tools we have, you could do that very easily. So it's pretty wild, but definitely a great choice of albums in the vault this week, as well as our new picks. And that is going to wrap up this week's edition of Music Mondays on the Nerdcast Empire. Don't forget, a lot of WrestleMania content coming up this week. Check that out at the Nerdcast Empire, wherever you get your podcast. And again, 1 week from today, we'll be back with another episode of Music Mondays with the music from March the 22nd. Big thanks again to Stoveleg Media for all their continued support of our podcast. And a big thanks to the guys for joining me once again. We'll be back this coming weekend with a couple of podcasts about WWE WrestleMania. That wraps things up for this week. For the guys, I am Matt saying so long. Don't forget to join the Empire, the Nerdcast Empire.